Welcome to the Grilling Truth about Sports. I'm your host, Mike Goodpaster. Today, we're going to discuss the history of the Cincinnati Bengals, Mike Brown, Paul Brown, the ownership of the Bengals, and it is always a hot topic in the area where I live because I live in the greater tri-state area in Cincinnati. I've been a Bengal fan since I was born in 1968. And when I did this, I wrote an article first called about this, the dark history of the Cincinnati Bengals. And since writing that article, I found out even more dark things about this franchise. And today, we're going to break it down and we're going to go through the Cincinnati Bengals organization, especially the front office. Now, the Bengals are a franchise defined as much by frustration as by football. Since their founding in 1968, the Bengals' history has been marked by brief flashes of brilliance, overshadowed by decades of controversy, financial blunders, and chronic mismanagement. At the center of nearly every era of dysfunction stands one name: the Brown family. From the genius yet bitter control of founder Paul Brown to the nepotistic and tone deaf ownership of Mike Brown and now Katie Blackburn, the Bengals' lineage of leadership has too often been an anchor rather than a sail. The Browns have built an empire not on winning, but on leverage, and the fans have paid for it, literally and emotionally. Now, the origins of Paul Brown's vision and the roots of control. Paul Brown, definitely a football innovator without peer. He founded the Bengals after he was unceremoniously fired by Art Modell in Cleveland. Now, determined to reassert his legacy, Brown brought football to Cincinnati in 1968, just before the AFL NFL merger. His early teams were disciplined and competitive, even making the playoffs in 1970 after just 3 short years. And to think about Taya, it's not like taking an expansion team like Jacksonville or Carolina did in 96 and making the playoffs in a couple of years. It was much harder, especially since he was Paul Brown. Most of the owners made it as hard as possible for Brown to field a team. But while Brown's genius as a coach is unquestioned, his authoritarian streak and inability to evolve sowed the seeds of future dysfunction. Brown was a man who demanded absolute control, from play calling to player conduct, and resisted change in an NFL that was rapidly modernizing. Players remember this stingy environment vividly, having to buy their own sodas, bring their own towels, and practice at Spinney Field, a facility that some described as a glorified toxic dump. Many players that I've interviewed over years have told me about how bad Spinney Field was, how you'd go in, you blow your nose, nothing but black stuff would come out. Now, Paul Brown had a belief in loyalty. The only problem was Paul Brown's belief and loyalty only ran one way, and that was being loyal to him. And his refusal to empower others would soon cost the Bengals a dynasty. Now, you may ask, how could it have cost the dynasty? Well, you've got Bill Walsh is really Bill Walsh was the offensive coordinator in Cincinnati. And in the mid 1970s, Paul Brown had on his staff one of the greatest football minds in history, Bill Walsh. Walsh was his offensive coordinator. Walsh's offensive system, built on timing, precision, and innovation, would later revolutionize the game as a West Coast offense. Even Walsh said it should have been called the Ohio River offense. But Brown couldn't stomach sharing credit. In Walsh's autobiography, which I recently read, he detailed how Brown subtly undermined him, insisting to the media that he, not Walsh, was designing and calling plays. Now, he would go so far as to keep the headphones on. Walsh was up top calling the plays, and Brown was the one that would send the plays in, and he would take the credit for it. Now, as Walsh's reputation grew, Brown's resentment deepened. When Brown retired after the 1975 season, rather than promote his brilliant assistant, he hired his friend, Tiger Johnson, a decision that sent the franchise into a tailspin. Walsh was blackballed across the NFL. Brown reportedly told multiple teams that Walsh was too soft, unfit to be a head coach, effectively freezing him out. Now, a couple years later, when Walsh finally landed at Stanford as the head coach, he received a newspaper clipping about his hiring, mailed anonymously from Cincinnati, with the words "Burnt Bridges" scrawled across it. Walsh was certain that it came from Paul Brown himself. That jealousy cost Cincinnati immeasurably. Walsh would go on to win 3 Super Bowls with the San Francisco 49ers. Not surprisingly, 2 of them came against Paul Brown's Bengals. Now, the missed greatness of teams. I'll tell you, I've interviewed multiple guys who were drafted in the 1970s, and the guy who stands out to me the most was a man that became a friend of mine, Gary Jeter. He was being drafted in 1979. He was out of USC, great defensive lineman, and there was a lot of rumors that he might be picked by the Cincinnati Bengals. And he told me that he told his agent to make sure that Cincinnati knew that he didn't want to go play for that cheapskate Paul Brown. Now, that would really develop in the 1980s, because there was missed greatness here from Ken Anderson to Steve Young. Brown's distrust and even penny pitching continued to haunt the Bengals. In 1984, the team negotiated with Steve Young, intending to make him their top draft pick. They offered him a 3-year, $3 million contract, a hefty sum at the time. Young declined, openly saying he had no interest in playing for the Bengals and the Browns family. He instead joined USFL, who had been around for like a year at that point. That same year, first-round pick Ricky Hundley refused to play for the Bengals. Bengals lost Ricky Hundley. Now, imagine the alternate history this team could have. Bill Walsh coaching the Bengals in 1976, developing Ken Anderson into a champion, then handing the reins to Steve Young by the mid-'80s. Instead, Paul Brown clung to outdated philosophies, and the Bengals' window closed. Brown was a visionary coach, perhaps the greatest of his era, but as an executive, he was stubborn, frugal, and increasingly out of touch. His son, Mike Brown, learned those lessons very well. Now, when Paul Brown passed away in 1991, his son Mike inherited control, and the franchise quickly collapsed into chaos. Mike Brown's tenure became a masterclass in how not to run an NFL team. His hallmarks: nepotism, outdated management, and total disregard for modern football operations. He refused to hire a true general manager, insisted on handling personnel himself, and oversaw one of the worst decades in NFL history during the 1990s. From 1991 to 2002, the Bengals finished last in the division 9 times. But Mike Brown wasn't losing, not financially at least. Now, in the late 1990s, Mike Brown strong-armed Hamilton County into one of the most one-sided stadium deals in sports history. Using the threat of relocation to Baltimore as leverage, Brown secured public funding for Paul Brown Stadium, now of course called Paycor Stadium, forcing taxpayers to absorb nearly all the cost and future maintenance for his stadium that his family owns, that his family made money off of. The fallout crippled the county's budget for years, slashing public services and causing massive debt, all while the Bengals reaped record profits. Today, thanks to that deal and the windfall of TV revenue, the Browns family fortune has ballooned to nearly $4 billion. The people of Cincinnati financed a monument to mediocrity, and they got very little in return. Now, there's a lot of things here about the Paul Brown family that's really messed up. But how Paul Brown dodged the IRS, dodged, having to pay taxes after he died, and gave the ownership to his beloved Mike Brown is amazing. The Browns' family control of the team was challenged in court in the early 2000s. The death minority shareholder, Austin Dutch Knowlton. Courts revealed that the Brown family secured majority control in the 1990s through a complex stock deal with the minority shareholders. From 1994 to 2000, while the team campaigned for a new taxpayer-funded stadium, the team paid the Brown family over $80 million in salaries. Mike Brown received millions in general manager bonuses, even though he didn't hold that title. So if you want to see why the Bengals were so cheap in the 90s, it's because basically they used the money that they could have bought players with to pay off minority shareholders for the team to be owned by the Brown family. Now, don't forget, any money that was left over went in bonuses to the Brown family, over $50 million, while taxpayers were having to foot the bill for the new stadium. I mean, the IRS got involved in inheritance tax case in the 90s. Before his death in 1991, we touched on this a little bit a second ago. Brown set up a complex stock transaction to ensure his family could retain control of the Bengals without incurring massive estate taxes like anybody else would. In 1983, he sold most of his shares to John Sawyer, team VP, and he was a farming magnate, if I remember right, via a promissory note. Sawyer, in turn, granted an option to Paul Brown's sons, Mike and Pete, to buy the shares later at a fixed low price. Now, the IRS challenged this arrangement, arguing that it was a sham transaction designed to avoid estate taxes. The IRS claimed Paul Brown effectively still owned the shares at the time of his death. Now, the U.S. tax court ruled in favor of the Brown family. That's surprising, isn't it? Ruling in favor of a million-dollar family, finding it was a legitimate arm's length deal. Now, the consequences of this was because the court ruled the Browns didn't fully own the team until after the option was exercised. They didn't owe the massive inherited taxes that the government sought. The team's revenue in the 1990s was used to pay off the purchase of the team from the actual owners. So you needed revenue. How do you get the revenue? Well, don't pay for players. Let the team fall to shit and use all that money so your family can have a monopoly on this team. And that is exactly how the Cincinnati Bengals became to be owned by Mike Brown. Now, Mike Brown's front office was infamous for its draft disasters. It still is. Watch Shamar Stewart get his ass kicked every week. Watch Miles Murphy always be a couple steps behind. The Bengals have routinely reached for the wrong players. They've ignored glaring needs and resisted innovation. Among the worst examples, 1992, they drafted David Klingler while Boomer Esiason was still productive. Not just productive, he was right around 29, 30 years old. He had been the MVP of the league 3, 4 years before that. And they drafted David Klingler, and David Klingler was a guy that I don't think too many guys would have drafted in the first round. He came from a run and shoot offense with the Houston Cougars, which was nothing like what the Cincinnati Bengals offense was. Of course, Klingler failed. Then Boomer Esiason leaves, throws for over 500 yards in a game for Phoenix, has success other places, comes back to the Bengals, 1997. Wins them what? 4 out of the last 5 games. They actually finished, I think, 8-8, 7-9, and he played out of his mind. And instead of offering him a contract, Mike Brown, of course, decided to tell him, it'd probably be best for your life to go to Monday Night Football and get paid. So you had a dude who was playing great, fan favorite, maybe a few years left on his career, and you turn him down. Maybe that's because they wanted Akili Smith. In 1999, the Bengals rejected the Saints' offer of their entire draft class for the right to pick Akili Smith with the third pick of the draft. Smith becomes one of the greatest busts in NFL league history for the draft. It's just mind-blowingly stupid. Akili Smith was basically a starter for 1 year at Oregon, played at JUCOs before that. And they turned down an entire draft class from the Saints. Now, the good point is here, it's 1999, so that entire draft class would have been crap if the Bengals would have drafted it. In the 2000s, you fielded rosters littered with players known for more arrests than accomplishments. By the mid-2000s under Brown, the Bengals were dubbed the Cincinnati Convicts. 10 players were arrested in just 14 months, and national outlets ridiculed the franchise as a haven for criminals. When Marvin Lewis was hired in 2003, no matter what you think about him, he brought the franchise its first semblance of stability in decades. Lewis led the Bengals to 7 playoff appearances, an extraordinary achievement considering the dysfunction above him. But without control over personnel and forced to work with Mike Brown's outdated structure, Lewis could never push the team past the wild card round. He was 0-7 in the playoffs. But simply getting Cincinnati into the postseason under those conditions was in itself miraculous. You know, the other thing is the Bengals had 5 straight playoffs in a row they made it to. So what'd they do after the 5th playoff run? And the 5th playoff run was the one in 2015 where the Bengals, if Andy Dalton doesn't get hurt, maybe they would have won a Super Bowl. They were 10-2. Dalton was one of the favorites to be the MVP. Hurt his hand against Pittsburgh. Team fell apart in a playoff game against Pittsburgh with A.J. McCarron there. What did the Bengals do after that? They let Kevin Zeitler and Andrew Whitworth go. That's what Bengals do. Then you get the Zach Taylor era. The Bengals turned to Zach Taylor in 2019, a coach with no prior head coaching experience. That's it. After 2 rebuilding years, fortune, not management genius, saved his ass. Anybody would have picked Joe Burrow in the 2020 draft. They drafted Burrow, and for once, they didn't screw it up. Burrow's talent masked the organization's structural flaws. He led the Bengals to 2 AFC championship games and a Super Bowl. Yet, even now, the same issues linger. An undermanned scouting department, only about 8 full-time scouts. Everybody else in the AFC North has 30 to 45 full-time scouts. The league average is 35 to 45 full-time league scouts. They miss draft picks on offensive linemen continuously. And a frugal front office lets stars like Jesse Bates walk without adequate replacements. Now, despite the team's recent success, the core problems of this team and this front office have not changed. The Bengals remain a family business first and a football operation second. Duke Tobin has long served as the de facto general manager, but his true authority is unclear, and Mike Brown's shadow always looms large. Now, with Katie Blackburn taking a bigger role, the next generation of the Brown dynasty has already pressured Hamilton County for another sweetheart stadium deal. And, they're going to get it. And the fans, once again, will have to foot the bill while ticket prices go up for a inferior product, which is what it's been for the last 2 or 3 years. The story of the Cincinnati Bengals is not one of failure by accident. It's failure by design. For more than half a century, the Brown family has valued control over collaboration, profit over progress, and loyalty over leadership. Their rare moments of success, from Ken Anderson to Boomer Esiason to Joe Burrow, have happened in spite of ownership, not because of it. And now, as the city braces for the rest of a football season without Joe Burrow, for the rest of a football season without a defense, Bengal fans can only hope history won't repeat itself, but it will, because history is the future when the Brown family owned this team. Zach Taylor was hired because he was a quarterback coach for Sam McVay. I don't know if the Brown family knew it or not, but he was a failed offensive coordinator with the Cincinnati Bearcats almost a decade ago under Tommy Tuberville. You gave him Joe Burrow. You had a roster that could win. And then you slowly let the roster fall apart. Very similar to the 1988 team, which was, I think, the first or second youngest team in the NFL in 1988 when they went to the Super Bowl. And by 1991, the team was gone. David Folger was gone. Joe Kelly was gone. Multiple guys were gone. The veteran leadership, like Reggie Williams, had basically retired. And then the team went to crap. And it's got to make you wonder, did they not re-sign these guys because they're trying to set up this sweetheart deal so they don't have to pay estate taxes and then the kids can own the team after Mike Brown dies? All indications would say that's probably very possible. The scary thing is, almost anybody you interview with that's played in the NFL knows that the Cincinnati Bengals organization is like this. Nothing will be done. Basically, the people of Cincinnati have turned the Brown family into billionaires. It's a damn shame because they don't deserve it. They deserve nothing. Joe Burrow will probably be wasted. How much more Zach Taylor do we have to go? And if you can't win it with Joe Burrow, how the hell are you ever going to win a Super Bowl? If you're a Cincinnati Bengals fan, you've been screwed over your entire life. If you're one of those Bengal fans that's below the age of like 25 and doesn't realize the things that have happened here, whenever you see a 50, 60-year-old Bengal fan get pissed off, don't claim he's not a true fan. A true fan gets pissed off. A true fan is upset. A true fan is stuck with this team no matter what has happened. They've been beaten, they've been abused, they've had their money taken, basically stolen with the product that is put on the field. Now, you had Donald Sterling, was the NBA's worst owner of all time, right? With the Clippers. Man, there's been a lot of bad owners in the NFL, but I don't think there's ever been a more pathetic ownership group. A bunch of thieves is what the Brown family is. I remember listening to the recently passed Bob Trumpy ripping Paul Brown, Mike Brown all the time on 700 WLW. I used to love listening to that because at least somebody was putting them to account. And my last thought is this. I just brought up Bob Trumpy, a man who should be in a ring of honor that should have started probably in the 90s, but it didn't. And now Bob Trumpy's passed away before he ever got in that ring of honor. And there's other men that belong in that ring of honor. The one that stands out the most to me would probably be Reggie Williams. Could the Brown family ever get anything right? They finally get a ring of honor, but they limit how many people can go in. They put younger guys in first. And you have people, not saying Reggie Williams is going to die because Reggie Williams is a tough SOB. He going to be around here for a while. But why are we going to risk that? It's just like Ken Riley. Not the Brown family's fault, but the NFL's fault. Ken Riley should have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago. But when he finally gets elected, he has to have his family speak for him because he's no longer here. I would like to see the Cincinnati Bengals honor the players that were here while they're here before they're gone. I don't think that's too much to ask, especially when you're getting, your stadium upgraded for another $1 billion probably. The problem is nothing will ever change in Cincinnati as long as the Brown family owned the Cincinnati Bengals.